Hello and welcome to our next panel. Really hope that you're enjoying the day so far, and if you're just joining us for the first time, welcome to this discussion. Just a reminder that we do have a Q&A function to the right of your screen. Do put in your questions throughout the panel and I'll try and put as many as I can to our guest speakers. Now, with more than 230 councils in the UK declaring a climate emergency and the public sector under increasing pressure to reach net zero targets, with the cost of living crisis, high energy tariffs due to instances such as inflation and the war in Ukraine, does digital and data have a role when tackling decarbonisation? That's the big question today. Smart buildings as a concept have in part been brought to fruition, so what next? Can data play an intrinsic role in decision making to deliver net zero in time? Well, in this panel discussion, we'll hear from leaders on how the public sector can use data and extract value to improve public services whilst hitting their net zero targets. To help us gain some insights, we are joined by a really impressive panel. Let me introduce you to Professor Tom Jackson, Professor of Information and Knowledge Management at Loughborough University. Tom has over 16 years of experience of research and industrial consultancy and secured over £20 million of research funding. His research areas are email, social media communication, information retrieval, and applied and theory-based knowledge management. We also have Christine St. John Cox, who is platform lead for the complex site Decarbonisation and head of energy partners at Energy Systems Catapult. Andy Hunt works as Green Energy and Sustainability Manager for Oldham Council, one of 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester. Andrew's role is Programme Delivery Manager for Oldham's Green New Deal, the first local authority Green New Deal strategy in the UK. As part of his role, Andrew works closely with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And we also have Brett Willers, who's Head of Climate Change and Sustainability at Coventry City Council. Welcome to you all, just joining us onto the main stage. And as I said earlier, please do submit your questions using the Q&A function, and I'll keep an eye on those questions as they come in. So I've got a question for you all. It was the question I mentioned, a big one to start with in the introduction. Does digital and data have a role when tackling decarbonisation? Let's start with you, Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. Absolutely, Peter, but maybe not how you think it does. So I'm coming from the opposite side of things, that maybe we have too much data. So why is too much data an issue? Well, actually, you might not believe it, but it actually contributes to carbon emissions. So we know the data warehouses around the world contribute 3% of global carbon emissions, which is more than the aviation industry at 2.7. So I'm coming from a totally different viewpoint. Yeah, data can be good, but are we keeping data for too long? So it's back to the information governance argument.
Excellent. Christine, over to you with that same question. Oh, we can't hear you, Christine.
All right, I had to unmute. That's fine. No, that's great. So actually, I agree with you. I'm a total advocate of what I call not over metering, and actually just metering and understanding what's going on, because the information that you get from a site, from a building, from any kind of activity that you're trying to decarbonise really does give you the evidence of whether or not it's working. So it's really important to have. But one of the big challenges is that there is a propensity to put too many meters in. And in the program that we ran, Modern Energy Partners, what we found was across 42 big complex public sector sites that we experienced sites that had 300 submeters on it at circuit level, that people didn't know what it was and weren't able to use or process the data because it took too much time. So there is a key message that Tom started on, which is about digital and data information can really help, because it helps build credibility and build a business case, but to not go over the top in what you're trying to do, to have enough data to be able to be meaningful, but no more than that.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm not sure whether you prefer Andrew or Andy, so I'm going to say both. What do you think?
So yeah, either will do. Honestly, I've been called much worse in my time, so either is fine. So yeah, so I'm going to come down well and truly firmly in the data is good camp. So as I work for a local authority, and we're looking at how we can decarbonise the entire local authority area. Of course, the national target is 2050. In Greater Manchester, it's 2038, and here in Oldham, we've got 2030 as our target. And one of the very first questions that comes up when we're talking about how we achieve this is, well, what infrastructure do we need to actually get us to net zero? And we're talking about the full range of infrastructure, whether it's district heat networks or electric vehicle charging, solar farms. We need to know what technology we need and where it can be situated. So data is absolutely key here. And I'm sure it's something that we'll come on to, but Energy Systems Catapult, as it happens, have been helping us. Greater Manchester has somebody's fire alarm there. So Greater Manchester has a project called the Local Energy Market Project, and Energy Systems Catapult have been part of that, and have been helping us answer this question about what infrastructure do we need. So data, absolutely key.
Brilliant. And Brett, welcome. You may have missed that opening question, but I've just asked the whole panel, does digital and data have a role when tackling decarbonisation?
It's vital. Totally. But yeah, as you know, we were the Regional Energy Systems Operator when the pilots with Catapult UK, and data was where everything was at, and that was the major stumbling block, is where you can't access data. So something which we did manage to do as a result of that work was get resources from ExoServe, who provide all the gas utilization data per household on a 30-minute interval period. So we had all that data for a year. It's massive data, but extremely useful if you're trying to target retrofit programs or trying to do any work, find out what's going on. But that stuff is not normally available. Now, as a result of RESO, there's now discussions with Ofgem that's probably going to make that accessible to local authorities. The question is whether it's at a price. It costs us about £16,000 per annum just to get that data set. Data is critical. It really is essential if you're trying to get energy, especially when you're city-wide level. You've got to. In our case, we've got some really anomalies in relation to our infrastructure and grid network. We need to have that detailed understanding to be able to plan for the future, and that is heavily dependent upon data.
Yeah, well, I think it was a bit of a trick question. I thought you'd all think it was pretty important, but it's good to understand how and why. So I'm going to keep an eye on the questions from those who are joining us today for this session. But I thought we'd start with basics, just so we've got it out there. Tom, it sounds like a very basic question, but does data have a carbon emission?
Well, many people believe it doesn't, but unfortunately it does. So we go back to what I said originally. Your data is normally stored in the cloud. So if you take your personal devices, your phone, you take pictures, you might store them on Google Photos or in the iCloud, but they all go into the cloud. And it's not just one set of pictures. They normally take maybe 6 or 7 copies of those pictures. So they're all stored in a data lake, a data warehouse, or a data center. And of course, to run these, you need electricity. And you can say, well, they've got solar panels. It's all okay. Well, they do have solar panels and they're getting improving all the time. But the problem is data is increasing or doubling every 2 years. So you've got your carbon emissions from your data warehouses, which is about 3% of global carbon emissions. And then I agree, data can be absolutely brilliant. But do you know what, Geeta? In these data centers, 65%, that's right, 65% of the data that's stored in there is what's called dark data. So it's used once or not at all. So if we go back to the analogy of storing all our pictures on Google Photos or iCloud or somewhere else, how many times do we go back and delete this stuff we don't really want? The multiple copies of the photos or things we just don't need anymore. And that's what we've got. We're collecting all the data all the time, but we're not necessarily managing that data. So we were saying before, you're taking data every 30 minutes from gas readings and electricity readings. Do we need it every 30 minutes? Could it be once a day? Now, in some cases, you might say, yeah, you do need it every 30 minutes, which is absolutely fine. But it's just thinking about it, about how frequently, so the cadence of data, how frequently do you need this data and what you can do with it then. So it's having that business case really for me. And I don't think we really think about it, because in our minds, data is really quite cheap to get hold of. Well, £16,000 is not cheap, but in reality, it's relatively easy to get hold of.
And it's a really interesting point, and I can see lots of nodding and smiling. I just wondered if any of the other panelists have anything to add on this idea of dark data, which, you know, we use once or we forget's even there. Christine?
Well, no, I mean, I love it. You know, as I come back to my over metering, where people don't do anything with the data that they're collecting, and that you need to collect the meaningful stuff. But I would push back on the half-hourly data, because it is particularly important if we're trying to decarbonize, to be able to see daily profiles and be able to design stuff around it and be able to see what's happening as we move towards flexibility, but only for one data set perhaps, or a limited number of data sets, rather than it having to be, as I said before, you know, 300 meters for one building is excessive, and you're not going to use that. So there could be some streaming there.
Great, you were agreeing there.
Oh yeah, it's I mean, one of the things is actually maybe we can use these servers to heat our swimming pools. Have you heard of a recent initiative of using energy that comes out from those systems to actually space heat? Or in this case, was heating a pool using servers.
We were
Which is
actually,
quite
sorry
clever.
to interrupt, we were actually speaking to about that in an earlier panel, so it has already come up as quite an innovative way of using that energy.
Yeah, I was thinking about the logistics, but it's interesting.
So I've got a question that's come in, which I'd love to put to you all. This is a question from Nick Murray. Nick asks, which are the most reliable low carbon data service providers? Any industry comparison / scrutiny reports? So which are the most reliable low carbon data service providers? Any recommendations from any of the panelists?
I wouldn't like to recommend any, but it depends in which country you're in. So if you're in this country, if you go for the big suppliers like Azure or Amazon Web Services, there are many others out there. They can give you the green credentials. So before you actually sign up with them, you can actually work out actually how green their data centers are, data lakes are, how they cool the system. Do they heat up swimming pools, or do they heat up residents? Where you go further across the world, and that's where the data centers could be, so your data might not be in the UK, of course, they are less green. So I think you've just got to speak to the supplier in the first instance to get the credentials of how green their data storage is, because it's a bit more complex than that, because there's many different tiers of how you can store data.
Would anyone like to add to that? Very good. Thank you for that question, Nick. Another question that's come in is from Isabel, who asks, does every household need to have a smart meter? What are their carbon footprints? Smart meters, what do you think?
I would say for the individuals that you can have it's sometimes when you mention that to the public, they think that's big brother control, and it makes people very anxious and nervous. But the systems now, like I have at home, where you can monitor your energy usage on a regular basis, that is really, really important. It helps people understand how it affects their fuel bill, what impact they have on their day-to-day usage. I think that's focused attentions quite well. Many moons ago, way back in, well, prehistory really, kind of about the time of the Rare Earth Summit, I did something in Cardiff with the New Economics Foundation, which Leicester City and Middlesbrough are involved in as well. It was called Eco Feedback, and it involved residents in trying to monitor their energy readings on a daily basis, and then for each week we gave them a degree day conversion figure, which went in the local press with lots of advice. Tried to simplify it as much as we could. People that participated in that when you think about when you pay your fuel bills, they're usually estimates, they're usually quarterly. You don't really think much about how you use energy. Whereas when you go shopping each week, you get your weekly shopping bill and you know exactly what you're spending. You can control it. So the advantages of the metering system, I think, is it helps people. And back then, when we did the eco feedback, there was no such technology around, so we were trying to do something manually. The average household savings during the trial period was around £20 per household. So actually, it was quite significant. It did show that it was affecting people's behaviour. We combine that with advice. So with the new metering, if it's used in a way that informs people, that could be quite helpful for individuals in terms of their understanding about their energy use and sort of modifying behaviour, particularly if you compared that with providing advice and information, whether it's low key stuff for low income families around what sorts of, if you're applying a new appliance, what to buy, what things to look for out for, etc., or how to use existing appliances in more energy efficient ways. Though all those things add up, and we're talking about now increasing number of households that are in fuel poverty. So those sorts of things are really important for them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Brett. Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, really, I think possibly the concept of investing carbon is important here, because as our energy system moves towards more and more complex systems, and we're talking about building renewable energy generation locally, battery storage, smart grids, all this kind of thing, on a grid that's just was designed for electricity just basically to be pushed one way from big power stations down to consumers. And the increasing complexity of the grid means that we need to add in lots of technologies. I mean, even as far as there's some really exciting new technologies coming in around local energy markets. So kind of blockchain powered peer-to-peer trading platforms which match up local demand and local supply. And of course, all of this new digital technology that's coming in to manage these smart grids and to manage our new energy system, all of that will have a carbon footprint in terms of its ongoing energy use, the investment in the servers, all the rest of it. But I think we need to recognize that as we transition to a flexible low carbon system with lots of distributed generation, we're going to need this technology to knit it all together. And I suppose one thing that we don't hear about it very much, but what's the carbon return on investment? So you could look at the carbon footprint of your new servers, but is there a way of assessing, well, how much carbon is that actually going to save, that investment, as we switch to this low carbon renewable energy based system? So I think we can't we need to accept that we have to progress in this area, and that there's going to be a carbon cost to that. But of course, we've got to keep the ultimate goal of decarbonisation in mind as we're doing it.
Tom, I noticed you were wanting to say something.
Yeah, just a couple of points really. One was about, you're right, in terms of we've got to keep in mind the use of this data. So one use of having smart meters is that you can potentially keep the elderly in the home longer. So for councils, you can start to monitor. This is where the Big Brother comes in, to see, are they regularly having a cup of tea at 9 o'clock in the morning? So you see the signature of the kettle going on. Are they using the washing machine, the dishwasher, those sort of things? So you can actually check up on, without physically checking up on, just through smart meters, to see, can you keep people in the home for longer? But where it comes in, and this is where the information governance bit comes in, is that we store the data and forget about it. And that's what's causing the big carbon footprint for us. If you think about 65% of that data is dark data, that's the bit we need to cut down on.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Andrew, as well, for adding to that. Christine, let me bring you in. What do you see as the opportunities when it comes to data and decarbonisation?
So my general view is that it gives you a good status position to know where you are and where you're going to get to. We're talking about buildings here. But if I was buying a car, which is less an investment than a building, I'd have some understanding from a lab of what my building was going to perform at and how it would work as a whole system. But you don't for a building, because each one is bespoke and each one is built in situ. So all you can rely on is the information that you can gather at the time. And as a building services engineer, I know that you, when you build a building, you model it, but a lot of that is based on assumptions. Now, having real data gives you a real opportunity to actually start to see what the real impact will be. And at the Catapult, we believe that that's really important. We believe that by having data, and let's face it, most people have got smart meters now. So there is an opportunity to aggregate that data, but to be able to see what it could look like across the board. And that will start to give some surety and some understanding, not only of how a building's performing, but also how a building could perform once it's had some kind of technology installed. That tells you how the technology is performing. It will help investors think about what they do. It'll help behaviors. So there are so many benefits in having decent data sets. And it just feels crazy that we are where we are and we don't have enough data to be able to have some of that knowledge already.
Thank you. Let's move on, Tom, to sort of a practical question, really. If you're working on a data project in the future, how do you determine its carbon footprint? Where do you start?
It's a good question, Geeta. So yes, I'd leave all the legacy data behind and just start and think about the new projects. So we created a data carbon ladder, which shortly be on our website, and it's free to use. So if you're thinking about doing a new project and you want to get some sort of report, you've got to think about the data you want to bring in and how big that data set is. So this data carbon ladder, there's two versions. There's a real quite detailed version, and there's a real simple red, amber, green, where you answer some very simple questions, and it'll tell you where your project will sit. Would it be in the red? So it's kind of like, you should be doing much better than this. Is it going to be in the amber? Well, you could do a little bit better. Or is it green? So it looks at the data sets you're using, how frequently they're picking up data, and how frequently they change in size, how you're going to process the data. So where you're going to store the data, is it a data center? Is it going to be on a hard drive in your office? All the way through to maybe the artificial intelligence you apply. So is it just going to be in the spreadsheet, or are you going to do some predictive or prescriptive analytics, or even cognitive analytics? So it works all the way down to CPU time you're going to use on a particular project and how long you're going to store that data. It will then give you the carbon figure, if you use the full version, the carbon figure of that project.
Brilliant, thank you. Really helpful. So we've only got about sort of 6 minutes left. So if there is a pressing question, send it my way, and I will try and find time to put that to our panel. But Andrew, one thing I guess we have touched upon really, but it's about your residents. From a council perspective, a key barrier to the success of a new low carbon infrastructure is take up by the end users. How do we know that the infrastructure that you've identified is actually wanted by residents and communities, and that they'll actually own and use it?
I mean, it's a really good question, and we do know that the engagement of the end user is absolutely critical to the success of new technologies. I mean, one example, we're here at Oldham, we're involved in a project called Red Wolf, which it sounds exciting. It sounds like a Cold War thriller, but it actually stands for Rethink Electricity Distribution Without Load Following, and it boils down to it's an electrical heating system for domestic properties. It's solar panels, storage heaters, and battery storage, optimized by a smart brain, which can use inputs from time of use tariffs, weather forecasts, all this kind of thing. And it's a smart system, which we're piloting it in 19 council-owned homes, but critically, we found that the success of the system, even though it's mostly automated, depends on the understanding of the resident. So, even though the system is mostly automated, the resident needs to understand that and needs to understand how the system works so that they can make the most of it to keep their bills down. And this is true right across the piece. One approach that we're trialing here in Oldham is something called community-led energy planning. So working with Carbon Co-op, who are a local expert organisation, we've been engaging with residents to really ask them what what they think they need in their neighborhoods in the way of low carbon infrastructure. Whether that's they think they need an electric vehicle charging hub, or whether they want improvements to the energy efficiency of their homes. And it's this local knowledge, and coming back to data, this local knowledge of what's happening in people's neighborhoods, what local priorities are. And unless we address those, it's all very well having our grand plan for our local area energy plan for building solar farms and EV charging and all the rest of it, but unless it's led by residents themselves, and unless it meets the needs of residents themselves, then it can fail. Residents need to own it there, and they need to use it, and without that buy-in, the low carbon transition is definitely not guaranteed to happen. So, we're learning from our experience with Red Wolf. We're talking to our residents and community groups about what infrastructure they want to see in their local neighbourhoods, and I think that's really the starting point. And then we can start talking about bringing in the investment for this stuff and using our local area energy plan that Energy Systems Catapult have done for us. But yeah, it has to be residents first, really.
That's brilliant. And I love the name Red Wolf. I will remember that all day. I have got a question that's come through, a question and a sort of thought from Giles. Thank you for putting this through. I'm wondering why we would focus on data carbon footprint when our grid will be carbon neutral before long, and could be quicker if our leaders picked up the opportunity. Does anyone want to remark on that? Christine?
Yeah, I will. So you're right. So our grid is going to decarbonise, and when we get out to 2050, it'll be next to nothing, nearly zero, but not quite, because we realise that there's stuff that you can't always eliminate. But actually, part of the challenge is that means that we're transitioning a lot of other energy sources onto our grid, and so our capacity to be able to deliver that is going to be really challenged, not only in the generation, but actually in our network constraints of where everything is. So actually managing how much we're using is still equally important. And whilst we're busy focusing on decarbonising our fossil fuel usage, with all of the public sector decarbonisation scheme and our guidance, which comes out tomorrow on how to go about decarbonising, but actually the reality is that you need to balance that so that you aren't actually using more electricity. And financially, it's not going to benefit you either, because it's more expensive to use electricity than fossil fuels at the moment. So that's a sort of wider context. I hope that helps.
Brilliant, thank you. And Tom, would you like to say something too?
Yeah, absolutely. If we go back to where data's doubling every 2 years, and you think about Ireland and all the data centers out there at the moment, they have not got enough energy to supply all the data centers and all the households. So at some point, something's got to give. So we can keep on burning fossil fuels, but that can't keep up with it. So even renewables won't be able to keep up with it. So at some point, we have to take responsibility. It's kind of like recycling of data or end of life of data. We need to get rid of it, because if you think about renewable energies, you think about solar panels on these data centers, they're quite costly in building them in terms of carbon emissions and the chemicals used to create the solar panels, the batteries to store them. So let's do our bit and just think and consider every time we start a new project, do we really need all those data sets? Do we really need it every 60 seconds, or can we push it out further?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions that have come through. We have run out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you for another great panel. Thank you to Professor Tom, to Christine, Andy and Brett for your time and all your insights. We are now going to take a break to digest what we've learnt so far. We really hope the discussions have kept you engaged, and there's plenty more to come this afternoon after the lunch break. So we will see you back here at 2 p.m.